All right, so there are certain legalities under US law which are going to impact how this directive plays out. First being the Posse Comitatus Act. Guys, sorry, I didn't study law, but here we go. We do know what it is, and where I'm going to explain it to you. So it's basically like US military involvement in domestic or like quasi law enforcement operations that are restricted. Okay, it requires clear justification. So, in order for US forces to hit Mexican or Venezuelan soil and actually like take on these initiatives to attack who they declare foreign terrorist organizations, there needs to be this clear justification. And I think that finding that justification actually won't be very difficult for them. Certainly when it comes to dealing with, like, okay, a regime change, for example, in Venezuela, where Maduro has a $50 million bounty on his head. Okay, that's double the bounty that they put on Osama bin Laden after 9/11. Just imagine that. And then also when targeting drug cartels in Mexico, saying how many people have lost their lives to fentanyl and to cartel violence, I guess could even be one. Even like the crimes going on at the border. I think that justification for this administration is certainly there. Now, another one is there's obviously an assassination ban and war powers, basically meaning that extrajudicial. Now, certainly, of course, we have to talk about the assassination ban and war powers, okay, because extrajudicial killings of suspects, especially civilians outside of combat zones, could, of course, violate both US executive orders and the country in which it's taking place, like their legalities and any executive orders they have and treaties, and then also international human rights. As we're living in a time where it's like war after war in every region of the world, I think we've come to the realization that most of these entities could not give a shit about human rights violations. We've seen this over and over again. You can see it on my Twitter. You can see it all over social media. Um, it's horrible, but it's the reality, okay? And this is something that will likely be considered, but when it comes to in practice, I think that people would rather just do the paperwork and take the hit for committing these violations and, pay whatever fine it is, because really, there aren't many checks and balances that prevent these war crimes from happening, okay? Of course, like I said, there are ethical concerns that come along with this directive. Um, this is a big one for me. It's like the risk of civilian harm because over the course of my career, I have seen so much human suffering in people who are so far removed from the grim reality that they're living in. And I know that conveying that over camera, and especially when I'm just sitting here explaining it to you, isn't super persuasive, or, it doesn't tug at the heartstrings. But when you see death face to face and get to know a victim and really just like see horrific violence on such undeserving people, like people who should never have experienced this, it changes the way you think, it changes everything. And it's life-changing for so many people in horrible ways. So, conducting, like, foreign military operations against deeply embedded criminal networks, of course, could lead and likely would lead to collateral damage. And, of course, that provokes backlash. I couldn't give a shit about backlash. I mean, you see all these people protesting or, like, condemning groups, and I don't think that does anything. Even though we're in, like, this age of social media where everyone can be vocal and everything is so publicized, I think now backlash is just, like, reduced to cancel culture type of, um rhetoric where people are just like, "Okay, get over it." So, really conveying that message that, like, yes, so many people are dying, so they're using this directive as a way to go and combat the people responsible for the loss of life or quality of life is the only option that they have left. It still could lead to further damage. And I wish people could understand that. And I really wish that everyone kind of approached all of these topics with a little bit more compassion for the people who are going to be on the front lines without choosing to be there. Okay. Now, of course, this directive is also being perceived as like intervention. And we've talked about this, how when I report on how there's like CIA planes flying over certain northern Mexican states, or like a US military vessel docked at the port of Veracruz. People are like, oh my God, it's intervention. And it certainly appears that way. And I think that like we're at a point where any little action will garner a massive reaction from the public, because we're all kind of just sitting twiddling our thumbs waiting for this to happen. And this directive is like a breadcrumb of what I believe is to come. So I think that a lot of people are already bracing themselves for this. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Mexican federal government and Claudia Sheinbaum's administration is forming and preparing whatever they need in order to outright call this an intervention and um, an attack on their sovereignty. I want to get into some like historical examples and precedents of this happening, just so that you guys could get a better idea of what something like this could look like and really in the guts what this means. So, Panama, 1989, it was called Operation Just Cause, where US troops ousted Manuel Noriega. It was, of course, marked as a violation of international law by the UN for infringing on sovereignty. They went in, they did it anyways, okay? Then you have Operation Snowcap, uh, 87 to 95, the US led multilateral operation focused on training and support, not direct combat. And then a really significant example that I think mirrors a lot of what this directive is aiming to do in present day would be Operation Snowcap, which was from 87 to 95. Um, it was a counter narcotics operation conducted by the DEA and US Border Patrol Tactical Unit, and then also local military and police forces in 9 different Latin American countries. Um, Basically, it was to deploy army personnel to crack down on drug trafficking, the Medellin cartel, and there was, a significant amount of like drug seizures. It was like very significant also in Bolivia, which at the time was like this hot spot for the trafficking route. I think like over 50 tons of cocaine was seized. It was a lot of thousands of traffickers were arrested. Um, Hundreds of processing or, cooking facilities were destroyed, labs were destroyed. Now, of course, you look at something like this, okay, Operation Snowcap certainly is like a more successful example of this type of intervention. But then now we look fast forward a few decades later, and in the grand scheme of things, what did that operation really stop, prevent, or change in the entire landscape of the war on drugs? Nothing. Let's just be clear, really nothing. Essentially, this like narco terrorism framework was historically used against groups like FARC or Hezbollah, but cartels have evolved into basically like hybrid criminal terror entities. And I think throughout previous dispatches, my explanations of that have made that very clear. And I think that that's why it was so easy to have that justification to designate them FTOs, and why so many people were in agreement with it. Even people who are like for or against the administration, no matter where they stand on the political spectrum, this was something that a lot of people believe needed to be done, just because of how powerful, expansionist, and modern these cartels have become. And it really did just kind of change the conventional, like the way cartels operate now has certainly changed the conventional definition of what a drug cartel is in the scope of the war on drugs, because they are so much more than that. And you'll see that in their drone warfare and their multiple streams of revenue that expand so much further beyond drugs. All right, let's talk about my favorite topic. Unmasking the cartel politician nexus. The FTO status and this directive essentially would make it easier to track and freeze cartel-linked assets that are tied to narco politicians. This is a really spicy topic when I bring it up because there are a lot of people who are assume immediately when I bring this up that I stand somewhere on the Mexican political spectrum. And it's first of all, I am not Mexican. I cannot vote there. And I don't generally even participate. I don't participate in politics. But it's important to note that it doesn't matter which political party it is, what they stand for. I stand against corruption, period. And to this day, there has not been a political party that can prove to me, in the very least, that they also are against corruption. So it doesn't matter which political party is governing, who the candidates are. It's a matter of the actions and what they're doing behind closed doors. Okay. And a lot of the shell companies and properties and money laundering fronts are fronted by politically connected figures. And now we're seeing more than ever a lot of pop star icons, whether it be a boxer, a rapper, a singer. We're going to see more of that coming too. Now, let's get into what this could mean for Venezuela because there is so much going on in the scope of the relationship between the US and Venezuela right now, and how a lot of what's going on between those two countries has been outsourced to third-party countries, whether that be Venezuelan migrants being deported to Mexico, or Venezuelan migrants with alleged criminal ties being sent to Secot, the super hyper security max security prison in El Salvador. Now, there's three main entities rooted in Venezuela that the U.S. is particularly paying attention to. Of course, like I said, Tren de Aragua, Cartel de los Soles, and Nicolas Maduro. The U.S. essentially designated Venezuela's Cartel de los Soles, which was ostensibly led by President Nicolas Maduro, as a terrorist organization. Um, the administration imposed sanctions, and then also is now offering a $50 million reward for the arrest, or the capture of Nicolas Maduro. I think it's only fair for me to give a little bit of a rundown on really who Nicolas Maduro is and why he's such a large target right now of the United States. The U.S. essentially doubled the reward. I think former President Biden had actually boosted the reward to $25 million during his administration. Trump has now boosted it to $50 million and has accused him of being one of the largest narco traffickers in the world. Imagine being a dictator, the president of this country for so long, and being one of the largest drug traffickers in the world. Crazy resume, okay?